A very warm welcome. Thank you for joining me. You're looking at a nice old map here from 1578 of the Thames River and London. And what you can see, amongst other things, the Star Chamber there, that's where the Houses of Parliament now are. Here is Westminster Hall, that's where Edward de Vere had the keys and where he led the Queen under a canopy with his men every time the state opening of Parliament happened. Here, of course, you can see Westminster Abbey, and it is in Westminster Abbey that Edward de Vere should have been buried, yet he was buried in Hackney, but now we know that he was moved from Hackney and was indeed reinterred at Westminster Abbey. How do we know this? Well, I'll have to give you a reminder of that, and a very quick one too. Many of you will remember we looked at the dedication to the sonnets and we turned it into a grid of 19 letters across. We find various symbols, including the message to the Westminster at St. Peter's, South Cross Isle. Edward de Vere lies here. 0.176 times 10 to the power of minus 13, chances of that being sheer accident. So clearly that's no chance at all. It's put there by intent. We then went to the front cover. We found the Cairo symbol and we overlaid the front cover onto a ground plan map of Westminster Abbey. And by looking where the fourth T dot landed, we found the exact spot where Edward de Vere is buried. Where is Shakespeare really buried? I've uploaded that. It's a 50-minute explanation of it all, a much shorter version just to refresh those who've already seen it, In Contemplation of the Cryptic Mind. That's a presentation on this channel. And of course Monkey Business at Stratford upon Avon, which shows how the monument at Stratford upon Avon tells you that Shakespeare's actually buried in Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. But to the matter in hand, let's have a look at why. Why, for instance, was Edward de Vere buried in precisely this spot? Why not anywhere else in the whole of Westminster Abbey? Remember, of course, he was first buried in 1604 in the Hackney Church and was moved here in about 1619, certainly after 1616 and before 1624. I tend to plumb for 1619. Let's try to answer that question. Let's also answer the question of who significantly placed the Shakespeare monument directly on top of Edward de Vere's grave all those years later in 1740. Those are the questions I want to address in this presentation. Let's first look then at the monument as it now is. You'll notice that it's placed against a wall made of grey stone that doesn't appear to have anything to do with the rest of the abbey. Very incongruent stone, and a wall that only goes halfway up the pillars. That wall is covered with an awful lot of junk, which are memorials to other people like Keats, Shelley, Burns, Southey, etc. None of those memorials, in fact nothing that you can see in this picture with the exception of this one at the back here, which is the tomb of Geoffrey Chaucer, none of the others would have been there at the time when the Shakespeare Memorial went up in 1740, nor indeed with that appalling piece of Stratfordianist impudence carved on there, which was put there, believe it or not, in 1977. Total appalling graffiti saying William Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616, buried at Stratford on Avon. That, of course, is an allusion to the man from Stratford upon Avon who, for several centuries, we were duped into believing actually wrote these plays. Now, of course, we know that he didn't, but even so, even if it had been the case that Stratford Shakespeare was anything to do with this, it would have been an appalling act of vandalism to put that writing on there. So what I want to do now is doctor this photograph in such a way as to show the memorial as it would have looked in 1740 when it went up. So something like this, very, very pure now, no writing beneath his feet at all whatsoever, which in itself is peculiar, I have to say. If you go around the Abbey and look at all the monuments of this date, you'll find nothing like it. That area beneath would be covered in writing, normally speaking, praising and saying how brilliant he is. In fact, if you were to walk round the back of this wall to see the Prior monument, which is on the other side of it, you see that there's a huge amount of writing there at the bottom, praising him, saying, "Here lies Prior," talking about all his excellence and brilliance and telling us where he went to university and who his friends were, etc., etc., etc. Above it, in a slightly different colour stone, different colour marble, we see a lidded sarcophagus with two legs, and that, of course, telling us that he is indeed buried there. If we go back to the Shakespeare monument, well, yes, you do get the lidded sarcophagus with 2 legs in a different coloured stone, telling us that he's buried there. But then the extraordinary Masonic duplicitous 3 lines of Latin from Pope. Now, I do discuss these lines in a presentation which is called Where is Shakespeare Really Buried? Part 4. Do have a look at that if you haven't seen it already, but it essentially shows you how Pope deliberately made those 3 lines very ambiguous. So that it can be translated 124 years after a death, public love buried this man using the name William Shakespeare. Very ambiguous, but I don't want to dwell on this as I say at the moment. I want you, if possible, just to meditate on the purity of this monument as it stands there. In 1740, totally cluttered and despoiled now. And of course, in that purity, it becomes much more obvious the sort of Masonic messages that are going on. We see the 3 lines above Shakespeare's head very clearly, the 3 books beneath his elbow, and the 3 heads at his knees. He's pointing to the word temples, which is very Masonic. He's standing in something that looks to be a bit like a temple. In fact, the clarity now, having taken away all those side monuments and statues, shows up the enormity of the great 2 pillars either side of him, these pillars which are the B and the I, and not Ben Eonson, of course. They are Boaz and Yakin, the 2 pillars on the porch of the Temple of Solomon, which is so key to the emblemata, to the symbolism of Freemasonry. So the only thing you can see anywhere near which is remotely decorative is, of course, this wall painting here, medieval wall painting. If the Masonic monument to Shakespeare invites doubt or incredulity, perhaps it's no coincidence that it was placed next to this ancient drawing, ancient painting of the incredulity of Thomas, of doubting Thomas, spurring then the viewer to doubt what is going on here. Only a Stratfordianist wouldn't worry why there isn't Stratford Shakespeare's coat of arms on here. Of course, the Oxfordian doesn't worry. He knows that Oxford was a concealed poet, and to put Oxford's coat of arms, which would be the normal thing to put it on here, would be completely defeating the whole purpose of hiding his name, of burying it using the name William Shakespeare. And that is, of course, what's going on. I want to take you, if I can, back to the ground plan. There in red is where Edward de Vere was buried in 1619, and we saw the wall that is behind it. Notice that wall is not it was not constructed to the centre of the columns, which is odd. It's unusual. It was put up there before, as I said, put up before the Shakespeare monument, put up when the prior monument, which is there, was erected in 1723. So why didn't they put the wall central, the most obvious position to put it central to the pillars? Well, the only obvious answer, of course, is that doing that would have driven the wall right on top of Edward de Vere's resting place, and that was not what they had in mind. Prior, as I said, was a poet, and one of his patrons was Lord Burlington. It was Burlington who put a lot of money into Westminster Abbey, into the dormitory there, just at the same time as he was, as the prior monument went up. And it was Burlington, of course, who paid and initiated the Shakespeare monument in 1740. I believe it was Burlington. We have a record of 1726 that says someone put some money down to reserve that space for Shakespeare. So I'm pretty sure that was Burlington. Another feature which we have to be aware of, which makes the whole thing, the whole story even more extraordinary, is that when Oxford was buried here in 1619, there was a wall that went across the north side like that. Now, as I've said, the southbound wall exactly behind the burial site wasn't there. That was put up in 1723, 1724. Back in 1619, the wall went like that. And it was enclosing a space which, since the Reformation, was known as the Chapel of St. Blaise. It later became a vestry, but when Edward de Vere was buried there, it was the Chapel of St. Blaise. Here is a map going right back to 1723. So Edward de Vere was buried at that spot there, and it becomes fairly obvious, I would say, that what happened is he was buried beneath the altar of the Chapel of St. Blaise. just as Edward VI was buried underneath another altar in Westminster Abbey. And of course, you don't carve on altars the names of people buried underneath them, but great and distinguished men were buried underneath altars without their names on them. The Edward VI's remains were only discovered in the late 19th century. And of course, it is only now, in the last 2 years or so, that we've discovered that Edward de Vere was underneath this altar of the Chapel of St. Blaise. The wall on the north, marked in red there, was made of wainscoting. It was essentially timber. But the wall behind the altar was made of stone. And that's why you don't see on this map any monuments attached to the north wall. There are, however, 3 monuments attached to the stone wall behind the altar. The monument to Charles de St. Denis, dating from the early 18th century, marked 6 there. Monument to Thomas Shadwell, who died at the end of the 17th century, and right next to him, the wonderful, glorious poet Edmund Spenser, author of The Faerie Queene. Next to Spenser, you see what looks like a monument blocking the entrance to the crypt. It's not, of course, doing that. It is above the door of the entrance to the crypt, and that's marked 93. That's Ben Jonson's monument, which was put there, paid for by the Earl of Oxford of the Harley creation, and put there sometime in the mid-1720s. I'll come back to that. I'll also come back to the monument to the poet Michael Drayton, which is marked 4 there, and to Chaucer's monument here marked 7. Now, don't forget that this map you're looking at now dates from 1723. Go back 100 odd years, over 100 years, to when Edward de Vere was buried in St. Blaise's chapel under the altar there, and there were no monuments at all, except for 2. So Edward de Vere is there, and the only 2 monuments anywhere near him in 1619 were, of course, Spenser's. He died at the end of the 1590s, and Geoffrey Chaucer, who's up there. Now, we have looked in other presentations at some of the goings-on of the Freemasons, how they were very much obsessed with geometry. Geometry is the whole basis of Freemasonry, and it helps the Freemasons to understand how the universe itself was constructed, to explain the unity of Trinity and the Godhead and many other things. So, as you can well imagine, the triangle between these 3 great poets, the only 3 monuments in that area in 1619, is a very special triangle. If you look at its angles, you'll see that it has the angles of 30, 60 and 90 degrees. Very special indeed, a perfect right-angled triangle. The ratio of those angles could be expressed as 6:4, and of course that's the same ratio of the triangles in the dedication to the sonnets of 1609, and it was through that dedication, unravelling that encrypted message in that dedication, those 3 triangles, that we found that Edward de Vere was buried precisely on this spot. So 6:4 is an important set of ratios, but I can simplify those angles, the ratio of those angles, even more, 30, 60, 90, by expressing them as the ratio 1:2:3. And of course 1:2:3 is very apt, with Chaucer at 1, who was the earliest and the oldest and died the first, and then Spenser, who died a long time after, followed by Oxford, who died after Spenser. So there's a chronological sequence, if you like, to those ratios 1:2:3. Anyone who knows about their geometry will know also that a 30, 60, 90 triangle is special not only because of the ratios of its angles, but because of the ratios of its sides, which can be expressed as 1, 2 and the square root of 3. This means, of course, that there is twice the distance between the spot where Spenser was buried and the spot where Chaucer was buried, as the distance between Spenser and Oxford. So what is this all about? Well, clearly it's deeply symbolic. The 3 greatest poets of the English language are here united by a perfect geometrical right-angle triangle. And there's more to it even than that, because there is the sad expression of the truth while they are united in their genius by this triangle. We see Spenser and Chaucer, who have their names and their dates and their praise carved onto their tombs and are buried in the main part of Westminster Abbey, while Oxford, the disgraced, concealed poet, is hidden behind the wall in the chapel of St. Blaise, connected only, as I say, by the geometric triangle between those two great poets. So the placing of monuments is very important and very relevant, and particularly the monuments in this little corner, now known, of course, as Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. If we look at the monument to Michael Drayton, the poet, and of course that was put up after the Oxford Spencer Chaucer triangle, it consists of a bust with an epitaph underneath it. The bust, I don't know if you can quite see it in that little picture there, appears to be staring directly ahead and downwards. Actually, I have an engraving of it. It doesn't quite capture the way he's looking downwards, which he is, but you can see he's looking straight ahead. The point I'm trying to make is if you go to the site itself, you'll see very clearly that if you followed the line of sight of the bust of Michael Drayton, he is looking down and straight forward directly to the place where Edward de Vere lies buried. And if you look at the epitaph on his monument, it seems to be addressing the monument itself, the marble, telling marble monuments how to behave. Let thy readers know what they and what their children owe to Drayton's name, whose sacred dust we recommend unto thy trust. Protect his memory and preserve his story. Remain a lasting monument of his glory. And when thy ruins shall disclaim to be the treasurer of his name that cannot fade, shall be an everlasting monument to thee. So, you see what you're getting here. You're getting Michael Drayton staring directly at the unnamed, unmarked tomb of the great poet Edward de Vere, while his monument talks about how monuments should behave, using, of course, the same 3-3-3 pattern that we had in the sonnets, where we had the three triangles, the sonnet's dedication. So, for instance, we have 3 instructions to the monument: protect his memory, preserve his story, remain a lasting monument of his glory. You'll see how the name, which is the all-important thing that is trying to come across, is written 3 times, all in different font sizes and capitalizations. And equally, the monument is alluded to 3 times. Pious marble, monument, 3, 3, 3. It's the same Freemasonic message again. So whoever put the Drayton message was deliberately making a point, I believe, about the unmarked grave of Edward de Vere, directly opposite. And the same actually is going on here with the monument to Ben Jonson. It's a very plain monument. You can see it here. All it says on it is "O rare Ben Jonson." Not a lot of detail, what looks possibly like a cornucopia of gold at the top, a very Masonic sign. And almost identical to the way this was done on the Shakespeare monument, we have this symbolism, numerical symbolism of 3, 3, 3 at the top, the triangle representing 3, the 3 buttons on his jacket, and the 3 theatrical masts underneath. Imagine you're looking at it now, so you're facing the door underneath it down to the crypt, and look where his line of sight is pointing. Yes, he too is looking in the direction of Edward de Vere's grave, very much at exactly that angle. And look very, very closely, and you can see something peculiar about his coat. He's turned it inside out, of course, and the buttons are on the wrong side. I get very bored. I'm sure you've heard me getting bored and irritable about it before. People saying things are just mistakes. They're not mistakes. You know, this is carved by Risebrock. It was paid for by the Masonic Earl of Oxford of the Harley creation. They all knew exactly what they were doing. And putting the buttons on the wrong side was not a mistake, despite what one poet wrote at the time when it went up. On Ben Jonson's bust with the buttons on the wrong side, "O rare Ben Jonson, what a turncoat grown! Thou ne'er were such till thou was cast in stone. When time thy coat, thy only coat impairs, thou'lt find a patron in 100 years. Let not then this mistake disturb thy spirit. Another age shall set thy buttons right." Well, it's not a mistake. This person's pretending it's a mistake. Maybe he thinks it's a mistake. but is not. Ben Jonson is being cast here as a turncoat, a rewriter of history, and of course that's what we know he was concerning Shakespeare. So the fact that he's looking towards Shakespeare and being displayed as a turncoat is very pertinent indeed. Other contemporaries at the time talked of Jonson raping Shakespeare's fame, so there certainly was some irritation about the way Jonson had allowed the Stratfordian myth to proliferate. So both the Jonson and the Drayton monument seem to be commenting on the nameless grave of Oxford Shakespeare right there. Let us turn now to a larger map. Here's the south transept, or the South Cross aisle, and Edward de Vere buried right there between the two pillars in 1619, which at that time was closed off and was the chapel of St. Blaise. So his reinterment, when he was brought from, his corpse was brought from Hackney, would have been a very private affair, brought either up through Dean's Yard and the South Walk, through East Walk in the Great Cloisters and through St. Faith's, or in those days through the Little Cloisters and the Dark Entry. But either way, through the Chapel of St. Faith's to this very, very private spot. Chapel of St. Blaise, I don't believe that this is a coincidence. In fact, I don't really believe much in coincidences in this day and age. The people were so clever who did all this organising. Why the Chapel of St. Blaise? Well, we've seen the relation to Chaucer and Spenser's graves, but the St. Blaise is also significant because, as you can see from the horrible implement he's holding in his right hand, that is a wool comb. He was murdered, obliterated by wool combers, just as Edward de Vere was murdered and obliterated by a wool comber. At least his reputation was. There's a book in the library in Dublin, which is a 1640 copy of Shakespeare's poems, and in it someone has written in contemporary hand, Shakespeare was a wool comber, talking about Stratford Shakespeare, of course. And that's why in Stratford-upon-Avon, the original monument shows him holding a wool pack. He's a wool dealer, wool comber. So the wonderful irony you can see here, which is having the man who was murdered by a wool comb to be the patron saint over the chapel, guarding over the corpse, the remains of Edward de Vere, whose whole reputation was completely annihilated by a wool comber, Stratford Shakespeare. This structure is taken away, so of course we don't have that wonderful irony anymore. The beauty of that is gone. I don't know when it was taken away. In 1723, the historian of monuments, Dart, complains bitterly about it. He calls it a scandalous blot in the beauty of this part of the church, but it's still not taken away. In 1772, I found a letter in the Gentleman's Magazine complaining of the Chapel of St. Blaise, which would then, by that time, of course, was just a vestry, but the structure was still there, and he complains of it as one of the defects and deformities in that most elegant structure, Westminster Abbey. So, as I say, it's a good thing it was taken away from an architectural purist point of view, but a sad thing that it was taken away from the point of view of the symbolism of the concealed poet, the connection to the wool comber, and his being buried in an unmarked grave in a place cut off from the rest of the abbey. All that was very beautiful and significant, but it's all gone. Let's move on from why he was buried in that exact spot to who did it, who knew about it. Obviously, we're pointing to the Freemasons, and anyone who's followed the de-encryption of the title page of the Sonnet 1609 and the dedication page will know that it is full of Masonic symbolism. We saw the 4 concealed triangles on the title page, the allusions to 3 triangles on the dedication page, with a 4th, rather hidden triangle there at the bottom, made up of 3 T's and a 4th T at the bottom, the 4th T being the 17th T of the whole dedication. So you get this 1740, which alludes to Edward de Vere. But of course, what we're really alluding to is the number 1 symbol of the Royal Arch Freemasons, the triple tau, the 3 T's with the concealed upside down 4th T in the centre of it. We also saw on the title page the Chi Rho symbol. I'm showing you these again because they identify not just Freemasons in general, but a specific degree of Freemasonry called Royal Arch. I don't think in 1609, when the sonnets were published, or in 1623, when the first folio was published, or indeed when the monument was put up in 1740, that this degree was then called Royal Arch. But it had another name. But it is unquestionably what is now Royal Arch, and we can tell this by following the symbols. So there you can see on the left the triple tower. If you look at the one in the middle, you've got your 3 triangles. This is a New Zealand branch of Royal Arch Freemasonry. Your 3 triangles and the so-called sort of hidden fourth, if you like, the fourth drawn in by accident in the centre, and then just below it the triple tower. On the right, I've put a copy of a book, some Royal Arch terms examined, and straight away you can see the Tau cross, the IHS, that's in hoc signo, the triple Tau, and the Cairo symbol, which we used to find where Edward de Vere was buried. They were so important, these symbols, in leading us through the encryption. Please look at Where is Shakespeare Really Buried Part 1 if you haven't seen that, because I go through all of this. Very, very interesting that IHS happens 3 times, always directly beneath or on top of a symbol leading us to Edward de Vere's grave. Here you're looking at the title page of the Pocket Companion for Freemasons, published in 1735, so that's just 5 years before the monument to Shakespeare was put up on Edward de Vere's grave in Westminster Abbey. It begins, interestingly enough, we're talking about geometry. By geometry, which is the basis of Masonry, as well as of all other sciences, we trace out the wisdom, strength, and beauty displayed in all the wondrous works of the great author of nature, and thence with adoration reflect them to their all-wise, all-potent, and most amiable origin. So as I've said before, that geometry is the absolute basis of Freemasonry, and where you find hidden geometry, you know there's Masons involved, and the geometry helps the Mason to contemplate divine perfection. We'll move on to the 66th page of this little guidebook to Masonry, and we find a fellow craft's song to be sung and played at the grand feast. I don't know the tune, but you can see it begins, "Hail Masonry, thou craft divine." I'll just move on to the 6th verse, which is important to what we're studying. Then in our songs be justice done to those who have enriched the art, from Jabal down to Burlington, and let each brother bear a part. The line from Jabal to Burlington is very revealing. Jabal was the founder of geometry, according to the Freemasons, right back in biblical times. So to draw a line from Jabal, the important founder of the Freemasons, to Burlington shows that Burlington is the sort of top Freemason of his day in 1735. And it was, of course, Lord Burlington who promoted, sponsored, and set up the Shakespeare monument in Westminster Abbey. He was known as the Architect Earl. Walpole says he is known as the Apollo of the arts. Remember how Edward de Vere, who we think was leading this same branch of Freemasonry back in his time, was known as Apollo, and then that title of Apollo seems to go to Francis Bacon. So whoever's leading up this group seems to be known as an Apollo. Among Burlington's entourage, he is a patron, of course, of William Kent, who designed the monument to Shakespeare, who was the chief mason to the Royal Ordnance and obviously a Freemason. He also designed gardens and buildings for Burlington, very, very thick with Burlington. And Alexander Pope, the poet who wrote the 3 lines on the Shakespeare monument, those mystical lines that we looked at earlier. So these 3 are Freemasons. They all belong to the same group, and experts on Alexander Pope, on William Kent and Lord Burlington have all totally independently, and nothing to do with the Shakespeare authorship issue, identified Pope, Burlington and Kent as belonging to the branch of Masonry known as Royal Arch. So they're in it together. I heard a very interesting story once. Someone told me about the burial of Thomas of Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. We all know he's buried in Canterbury Cathedral. We don't know the exact spot. But it is said that at any given time, 3 people know exactly the spot in Canterbury where he's buried. And that when one of them dies, another is brought into the secret. I don't know how many Freemasons of the Royal Arch degree are aware that Edward de Vere is buried under the Shakespeare monument in Westminster Abbey, but I can guarantee you it's no fewer than 3. Okay, so the main symbol, as I've said, is the triple tower with its hidden 4th part, and I want now to look at some of the important architecture of Burlington's own house, which he designed himself, gardens designed by Kent, at known as Chiswick House, still there today. You can go and see it, open to the public and run by English Heritage. Here we're looking at one of the gateways to Chiswick House, to Burlington's house. Looks very symmetrical, doesn't it? But funny enough, it's not. Look at those baubles. You've got 4 on that side and 5 on that side. That, of course, makes up 9, the number that is symbolized by 3 triangles, and the IX of Jesus Christos. It was one of the key ways in which we unraveled the Shakespeare sonnets dedication. We found the 9 symbols on that grid. 9 is absolutely central to this branch of Freemasonry and its thoughts. Just beneath it, you can see, for want of any better name, the shape I've been calling a lidded sarcophagus. It appears above Shakespeare's head. I put it up there in the middle on the Shakespeare monument of 1740. And it is also, so I'm told by one of my Freemasonic friends, it is also used as a shape of a particular altar in Freemasonry, before which a Freemason kneels after his death and rebirth. So it's a very key shape. I've searched the internet, not knowing what it's called, for other examples of it. The only other place I found this shape was on a Freemasonic lodge in Cairo. Beneath here we see the urn, and you'll remember that the Masonic urn became the final presentation, the rebirth, if you like, of the 3 triangles on the 1609 sonnets, where we learnt that the sonnets were all that was left behind of the author, placed in the urn as by God and De Vere, the poet, vero nihil verius. If we look at the arch itself, you can see that it has 2 great pillars on the front. These are the pillars which in Masonic terms represent Jachin and Boaz, as I've just said, the pillars on the porch of the Temple of Solomon, and then behind it the arch, which with its very prominent keystone, the eye. And if you look at back at Royal Arch Freemasonry, it's totally consistent with that. The 2 pillars in the front, the arch behind, and the prominent keystone. Of course, lots of these elements, architectural elements, are brought from the Romans, from Vitruvius via Palladio, and it's no coincidence, though, why the Masons, particularly Burlington, Pembroke, who was also 9th Earl of Pembroke, who was also an architect at the same time, and other Freemasons were very obsessed by Vitruvius and Palladio. Let's go through the arch, as it were, and see Burlington's so-called house. I say so-called because lots of scholars have pointed out that what it really was a Masonic temple, though Burlington no doubt spent some nights there. But it was where Pope and Kent and Burlington and others all congregated. So one of the first things you'll see is the main structure is in the same shape I've been talking about, this lidded sarcophagus. The other thing that's very obvious to the eye immediately are the 3 triangles. So where is John Dee's quaternary hidden within the ternary? There should be, of course, a hidden 4th triangle. I can tell you where it is actually. It's right there. How do you know? I can hear you all asking me, because there's only one line that delineates that triangle, and that's the base line underneath the line of the banister, as it were. Actually, it's subtly concealed there, but the hint is given by the angle of the 2 staircases on either side. If you draw a line from the bottom left, top and bottom right corners, following the angle of the stairs, you'll see that line meets the entablature directly above the triangle of the 2 windows, and that it forms the 2 top sides of that triangle. And the baseline, as I say, is created by the banister, that banister being precisely halfway between the line. I've drawn the vertical lines on either side. So there's your hidden 4th triangle, and it's exactly there, of course, that you will find the hidden T of the triple tower, the upside down T. If you draw a line up to the entablature below the pediment, then you see that the whole house is covertly representing the most important sign of all, the sign of the Godhead, the Trinity, with its connection to earth, the 4th T of the triple tower, and that is represented by the whole central structure there. So These three, as I say, were the people who set up the Shakespeare monument, and therefore they all knew perfectly well, as they placed it above De Vere, that who Shakespeare really was. This has caused some muddle with Stratfordians, because they don't seem to realise that Alexander Pope was an Oxfordian and knew that Oxford wrote the plays. They bring out this line quite often that Pope wrote, "Shakespeare for gain, not glory, winged his roving flight, and grew immortal in his own despite." It's a narrow reading if you're a Stratfordian and say, oh, I know what that means. It's a grubby little sentence that means that Shaxper Stratford was a poor man who only wrote plays in order for money. Well, of course it doesn't mean that. The Pope is a Freemason, he's a poet, he's thinking in very lofty terms. He is not talking about personal gain. He is talking about the benefit to humanity, the gain to humankind. And he is talking about Edward de Vere, who gave up all sense of personal glory in order to write these amazing plays and poems for the benefit of humanity. That is a very, very key aspect of what Freemasons do. And he grew immortal in his own despite. So, he grew immortal despite the fact that he was self-effacing and that he did it for humanity. So that's what Alexander Pope had to say about Shakespeare, and is much confused by the Stratfordians, as indeed is this. And I want to finish up with the dedication to the first folio of 1623 and show once again how the Stratfordian mind trips up rather flatly looking at surface meanings and misunderstanding the underlying Freemasonic thought that's going on. So here we have the dedication of Hemmings and Condell, who did indeed know Stratford Shakespeare, of that there seems to be little doubt, but they're dedicating this first folio of Shakespeare's to the brothers, William, Earl of Pembroke, and Philip, Earl of Montgomery. Now we all know that the Earl of Montgomery was Oxford's son-in-law, and some of us also are aware that William, Earl of Pembroke, was betrothed for a short while to another of Oxford's daughters. He didn't actually marry her. But they are indeed brothers, but let us not be overly literal when we see them described as an incomparable pair of brethren. Yes, William Lord Pembroke and Philip Lord Montgomery were brothers, but they were also Freemasons. Lord Pembroke, in fact, was the Grand Master of the English Freemasons from 1618 to 1630, so he was the chief, if you like, of all the Freemasons at the time when this first folio was printed. Philip also, as I say, was a Freemason. To understand Freemasonry, you have to understand the great emphasis that is placed on brotherhood, friendship, and fellowship. In fact, according to the old Masonic charges, including the Grand Lodge number 1, it's known as the manuscript of 1583, the York manuscript of 1600, and the one known as the Inigo Jones manuscript, Freemasons are ordained that, and I quote, "you shall call Masons your brethren or fellows." You have to call them brethren or fellows, or indeed friends. So turning to this sentence here from Hemmings and Condell, that they published the Shakespeare's plays only to keep the memory of so worthy a friend and fellow alive as was our Shakespeare. This makes Stratfordianists jump up and down with excitement, as though they found some sort of unbeatable proof that Hemmings and Condell, who were known to Stratford Shakespeare, were treating Stratford Shakespeare as their friend and fellow, and therefore he's the man from Stratford. No, no, and double no, as I say. This is all Freemasonic, and it is absolutely correct that Hemmings and Condell, as Freemasons, would call Shakespeare, who they know to be Edward de Vere, as so worthy a friend and fellow. That is what Freemasons call each other when they're not calling each other brethren. Finally, and I am going over a bit of old ground here because I know I've put this on another presentation, but because we're talking about Freemasons and the Shakespeare Monument, let's just rehearse it. They finish up by saying, "And the most, though meanest of things, are made more precious when they are dedicated to temples." And that this is no coincidence that on the Shakespeare Monument itself, Shakespeare is pointing to the word temples, solemn temples, which in turn sort of brings up the idea of Solomon's Temple, and that we have the 4 T's and the 17 letters forming what is obviously a Masonic square along the top, the 17-4T. Hemmings and Condell go on, in that name, therefore, in the name of temples, we most humbly consecrate to your HH these remains of your servant Shakespeare. Again, very cunning, very duplicitous way of writing, because we've already had the term HH a bit higher up, and there it meant honours or honourables, and it was talking to William and Philip, the 2 brothers. But here HH is referring to God. You can see exactly how many T's there are in those 2 capital H's, and you realise it's another way of transcribing or representing the triple tau. So when you consecrate to your HH, you're consecrating to God these remains of your servant Shakespeare. So it is important that we understand all the way through the story of Shakespeare and his mysterious burial in Westminster Abbey that the key to understanding how it happened is through a careful watch of Freemasonry and following the symbols of Freemasonry, and particularly the Royal Arch. I think my next task will be to meet 3 key players in the current Royal Arch and see if I can take them through this and see if they will confess that in Freemasonic terms, God has now allowed the mystery, the secret, to come out, and perhaps they will help us now instead of hindering us by confirming all that we have found, that Edward de Vere, who was Shakespeare, does indeed lie buried under this very strange, very beautiful Masonic monument. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it.